Okay, hi. So glad to be here. So honored to share with you, learn with you, develop some shared knowledge about this process. As Warren said, I'm Rebecca Oberman. I have been working with the ACTA2 Alliance, YGSA, for about the past 4 years or so. This is in my capacity of working at MGH within the Center for Rare Neurologic Diseases. And my role is to develop patient advocacy and to enhance ways for the patient voice to become more central in the treatment development process. I have about over 10 years of working in patient advocacy outside of MGH, within MGH. And so the thing that's really kind of critical and important and interesting to me are ways to really amplify the patient voice throughout this whole drug discovery process, particularly with rare diseases. So you've heard a lot already about what that drug development process is like for MSMDS. And this is really a talk about how you, the families and patients, become really central in that process. So I hope we can build a little bit of knowledge about how to do that. The things I really want to touch on today are kind of these key questions, sharing a little bit about what the overall process is from early discovery through a treatment, particularly focusing on the patient process, how families can participate in that, and maybe some things you can do right now. I'll just keep talking and you'll make sure it all sounds good. Okay. And so with that in mind, I want to share what's going to look here like a little bit of a busy slide, but I want us to begin by talking just about what the overall process is in drug development. And so I tried to look for ways to make this a little bit less busy, but it's a busy process. So let's just start by kind of picking this apart. The middle of this really talks about the 4 elements of drug discovery, going from early discovery through approval and marketing. And the top tier of this really focuses on some of the basic elements that your investigators, the folks we're mostly hearing from here at this conference, are engaging in at each piece of discovery. And what I've tried to do down at the bottom is highlight a couple of the elements where patients and families can get centrally involved. I'm going to break some of those down further as we talk, but I wanted to start with this overview. So in the phase of early discovery, you have investigators focusing on some things we've talked about: developing cell models, gene identification, focusing on mechanism of action. What's going on in those cells? What's maybe going wrong? How can we begin to think about changing that? And down here at the bottom, in this kind of stage of discovery, we see that patients engage in, perhaps when they come to clinic, biobanking, giving samples, as many of you have done, building collaboration with researchers, and really helping researchers at the clinical level, often at the research level, understand what the unmet need is. What is the burden that your families experience? As we start moving into this preclinical research level, also things that we've begun to hear about: creating animal models. Mouse models are very often the model that's used. Beginning to test therapeutics in small animals, again, something we've been hearing about. And assessing early safety, safety being the first thing, making sure drugs and other therapeutics aren't toxic in those animal models. In this phase of research, in addition to continuing these earlier efforts, we begin to see some other elements from the patient side come into critical play. Disease advocacy groups start to initiate registry efforts. I'm going to speak to you about what a disease registry is. Creating centers of excellence to improve disease understanding. What I mean by that is exactly the kind of thing that's happening here at MGH, as well as other places. You noticed that Dr. Kanan earlier mentioned how not only valuable yesterday for those of you who were able to come to clinic was for you, but he mentioned how valuable it was for the clinicians, because instead of seeing an occasional patient in isolation, it allowed the clinicians to see a bunch of you at once. creating centers of excellence where numbers of patients come together at one time or as a community enhances robustly the clinician's ability to understand the disease. And that's a phenomenal benefit of creating a center of excellence. In addition, creating conferences like this, where, as you can see, the level of collaborative learning picks up enormously. And I'm going to mention something else later about how creating conferences like this can really amplify disease treatment trajectory. Next phase, as we enter into clinical research, you'll see investigators start to ask for your participation in natural history studies, something I'm going to talk about, as they also get ready to use those natural history studies in clinical trials of an actual drug. Here is where you guys are going to be asked to participate in those natural history studies. And what does that ask of you? As well as opportunities to inform the FDA, the body that actually approves drugs, opportunities to inform the FDA about your disease. How can you teach the FDA what goes wrong in your kids? What's going on and how can they better understand your disease while investigators are applying for those treatments? And then the last phase in terms of approval and marketing, what does it mean to go before the FDA to actually get a drug approved? So just want you to kind of have this overview of what it takes. And then I want us to just recognize that, right now, with a lot of what's going on in MSMDS, this is where we stand. So you can see this is where the bulk of the work is taking place right now. So this is where we're really going to focus on. I want to stop for a minute before I dive into some details. I added this slide kind of at the last minute. This actually just came out from something I saw from Global Genes. Global Genes is a really phenomenal patient advocacy organization. If you're not familiar with them, I encourage you to hop on there. It's one of the best international patient advocacy organizations for rare genetic diseases. And I will have all these slides are all available to you so you can look more at this. I don't imagine that you can read any of this closely, but I invite you to go find this slide. I like this because it highlighted 3 areas of family engagement in therapeutic development. So 3 areas that families can really focus on and why they're important. So I just wanted to touch on this for a moment. Global Genes kind of has this anatomy of a patient advocate, which I thought was kind of a cute display. And the 3 areas I just wanted to highlight here are that patients can really get involved in de-risking a disease. What does that mean? What does it mean to de-risk a disease? It means that you have keys by knowing the most about the disease in your child that can contribute to making that disease better known to the people who are creating a therapy. And as you can see there, they say that's really done by helping identify the patients, by helping fund the research, tough topic, but we got to talk about it, and by participating in natural history research. So that's kind of that top topic. The middle one really focuses on currency as currency. It takes money. It takes money the whole way through. And so it's important in terms of getting to know places like Global Genes that talk about how do we do the fundraising to keep this kind of rare disease research going. And then this last topic is something I'm also going to touch on again, which is that by developing things like a registry, you can collect information about your whole community that you can then use to incentivize more research. Okay, so they really focus on here about how this is a small rare disease. If we think about the data about this rare disease as just its own data, that can move forward some research. But there are data accelerators, and the FDA has one, for instance, where your data about your rare disease can be pooled with data from very similar diseases to help them look and say, how can the data from this rare disease, by being collected and examined in relation to data from other rare diseases, help us look for treatments that might work across them? So I just share this with you, encourage you to look look, further at that, to think about the ways that participating in these kinds of things can help move forward therapeutic research. I want to touch back and look a little bit more closely here about natural history. You're going to be hearing from Dr. Mussolino and perhaps from some other people about the opportunity very soon to participate in natural history research. I will say to you that one of the most fundamental things you can do as families, as patients, as advocates, to create and get a treatment authorized is to join natural history. You can't get a treatment authorized by the FDA usually without one. So there's really two kinds of natural history research that go on. There's prospective natural history and retrospective natural history. Natural histories are looking at how a disease progresses over time in a patient community. They're looking to understand what kinds of differences exist in the patient population, how much the same a patient population is, or what kinds of differences there are. And natural histories also help prepare for, plan for, and help researchers set up a clinical trial, enormously valuable. So a prospective natural history study is a natural history study that is conducted in a select group of people who have the disease, so a select group of people with MSMDS. It's often defined by age. There might be a specific age that researchers are interested in studying with the disease. And it is set up by certain criteria. Usually this population is invited to come to a specific center, might be multiple centers, but with an ultra rare population, it's usually a specific center. And they usually come perhaps once a year, maybe with like a virtual visit mid-year, for a specific set of tests that are going to be done. So it's a very regulated, specific kind of experience. It's governed by an IRB, an institutional review board that regulates exactly what's going to be done, and you have an opportunity to ask all kinds of questions and sign on to this kind of procedure. And through this, perhaps, let's say, over 3-year period that this kind of study might be done, the investigators are really looking again to understand what sort of progression there is in this disease going forward in these kids over time, and what sort of individual variability there is in the disease. Okay, so that's a prospective study. A retrospective natural history study, by contrast, aims to involve everybody in the community. Okay, so this isn't selective. This aims to involve everybody. This is an opportunity to collect all medical records that maybe you've ever had, all diagnostics, all imaging. And these records are then taken in a format where they can be searched and scanned, and gives the investigators an opportunity to understand the wider population at large, to sort of see the bigger trends that may have gone on. The combination of the two of these give clinicians a really deep and involved and nuanced picture of the disease. So you can see why these two sorts of studies, in tandem with all the other research that's being done, are incredibly valuable for being able to present a very detailed picture of the disease as a treatment is going forward. They can't be done without your participation. I want just to sort of highlight this slide as well. This again is another sort of graph that I really like, because in the process of drug development, there are multiple touch points and opportunities that you will have to engage with clinicians and researchers. You may be asked to participate in studies. You may be asked to help develop surveys about your disease, all kinds of different ways that you may be involved with the researchers. And I wanted just to highlight here that the depth and intensity of your involvement can vary, and you should think about the depth and involvement that you want to have. It can vary from, for instance, just being asked about the studies that you prefer to be involved with, all the way down along a continuum of being invited to give recommendations about the kind of clinical trials you want to participate in. Clinical trials involve a lot of your participation. There are kinds of studies that might be better and easier for your child to attend. So you can help shape those decisions, all the way down to a continuum of you having a really central voice in determining major aspects about the research that's going forward. And so I invite you to think about a graph like this, to really think about it not just being limited feedback that you can have in this process, but really having a leading seat at the table where your voice is quite central. In terms of central voice, I want to kind of give you the idea here about what a registry is. So I mentioned a natural history, which is a way of collecting data from the patient community that is usually academic and investigator-led. I also want to mention to you the idea of a patient registry, which is community-developed collection of data. Doesn't happen instead of a natural history. Very often communities like this decide through a leading patient advocacy group like A2A, for instance, that it's important to develop their own patient registry. So these patient registries, and I list the name of a couple of low or no cost leading patient registry organizations here. There are others that do the work of collecting and curating this data from groups like yours. And some of the reasons why are because, as I indicate here, a community that can gather and coordinate its patient data has a real opportunity to own that data and incentivize industry, researchers, and others to become involved with you as the stakeholders of your data, to get involved in the research process. You then are able to drive that process by having your data. Very often, natural history studies, after that data that's collected is used exclusively by those researchers, can get dumped into that registry. So it becomes a collaborative process of data collection. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of data accelerators, registry data collected in these kinds of platforms can be used now for things like the RDC-DAP, which is happening at the FDA, to work with small groups of data, like might be collected here, to see how that data can be used alongside other similar diseases to look for treatments together. So there are multiple reasons why registries for rare disease groups are incredibly valuable and something to really be considered. Lastly, I just want to speak for a minute about, again, thinking along that continuum and that central box that I mentioned, where this group finds itself right now. Some opportunities that the FDA has that are relatively new, to be honest. The FDA has usually and foremost been there as a process of regulating investigator-led or pharmaceutical-led applications for drug treatments going forward. But the FDA over recent years has really come to listen and respect the need to hear from the patients and the patient voice about the unmet disease burden. And so there are FDA opportunities that are really important for the patient community to learn about because they significantly impact the rate at which drug treatments going forward are approved by the FDA. So there are two things that I would recommend this community becoming aware of. FDA patient listening sessions are structured opportunities by the FDA for them to meet with you and hear about what it's like being a family with a child having MSMDS or being a patient with MSMDS. These are structured opportunities for you to introduce your disease and for them to really learn, what is this about? They bring people from different places in the FDA to come and understand this. And these are recorded, documented listening sessions that are archived at the FDA. Similar slightly different focused, are patient-focused drug development sessions. Those are also opportunities where you apply to the FDA for one of these, and the FDA brings together people who would be part of the drug development process for treatments coming forward to the FDA. They're intently interested in understanding what the unmet disease burden is. How does living with this disease impact families and people living with it? Again, archived and indexed so that when a drug application comes to the FDA, this record of the family and patient experience is brought to the foreground. Super, super important to have that so that that voice is at the table and amplified during that drug approval process. That's really critical. Not everybody can meet at the FDA for one of these, and so they have externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. That's a process where they give a structured opportunity to have meetings like those that would be held at the FDA, often adjacent to meetings like this, where there might be, as so many families have gathered together, an externally patient-focused drug development meeting held adjacent to a meeting like this. I think it's been super encouraging that the FDA is doing so much of this, and I think it's an opportunity probably not to be missed to have so much of the patient voice be amplified there. So I've shared a bunch of mechanisms and opportunities for the patient voice. I think a number of these, starting with the natural history, but certainly not leaving out registry and FDA opportunities, are things that you will be given opportunities shortly to join in about. And I think, everybody here should see themselves as seeking and wanting the opportunity, to engage there. I think one of the things I would leave you with is a statement that is common in the patient advocacy world, which is nothing about us without us. And I think it's something I think a lot in the rare disease patient advocacy work I do, but the way this is strengthened and done best, if you think about that nothing without us, but nothing about us without us. It happens for you when it happens with you. And I think the kind of collaboration that you see with investigators, clinicians, and you here at this meeting invites and welcomes your participation at every stage of the meeting. So thank you so much. And I look forward to any questions and the rest of this meeting.
Any questions? We move on to our next section.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I know this seems to be a lot, but I think the last two sentences that you said are really what are making things happening. So I want to ask a question to Rebecca. Rebecca, don't go too far. Just an overall, for when you're repurposing a drug, you take something that is approved, you ask the FDA to let you treat it, and then you have to show them the things that Dr. Milowicz and we are working on, which is data somewhere that is doing something and that is safe to the best of your understanding. So, and that is a faster track, and that is a lower cost. When you're talking about ultra rare disease genetics, we know are in the era of trying to get to the root problem, which is the gene, and those are much more expensive drug development. So almost near impossible to get any pharmaceutical biotech company to work on your 55 patients because they don't see a reason why to do that large investment. And I think this is something that I wanted to ask you, and what is your recommendations on this? In ultra rare and rare diseases, it is usually through academic medicine that we can do a big difference. Yeah. It is in academic medicine that we can treat patients, so we don't have to have Novartis take us on or Pfizer take us on. They may later. It happened to spinal muscular atrophy. I don't know if you guys are aware of this wonderful gene therapy for little babies. Was developed in a collaboration with DC and here. And at the beginning, it was all academic, okay? Until they show they have a patient that was doing better. And then Novartis got interested, and they were working with a little startup that was created by the investigators in the academic center. My question to you, for the families, when they're thinking about a registry, when they're thinking about retrospective or prospective natural history participation, and this idea of biomarkers, or consortiums in research in academia, is there anything that families can do when they put themselves through giving data, looking for your medical records, your CDs and everything, to an investigator, whomever that person is in whichever country, to assure that some of those data points, if that investigator retires, if that investigator leaves the hospital, what happens with that? Is there any way as families, as advocacy groups, to do anything to have, as you were saying, be at the table? Is there any way to recoup, just to put it in simple words, that database or part of the database? Are there any sort of contracts, any sort of agreements that are being done in rare diseases? So I think that's something very important for you, because if not, you guys are very few, and you need to make sure that if someone doesn't work any longer, or if something doesn't go the way, we still want to know what happened. You guys want to know what happened. That would enable the next study on whomever is working in the disease.
Yeah, it's an awesome question. So thank you for that. Yeah, there are contracts, and I think what Dr. Mussolino highlights is the need to be in control of the data that you share. So two things I would say. I think it highlights the importance of a registry where you're curating all of your own data at the same time that you're sharing it. So registries are super important in that way. But I think it's also really important that when you are working in coordination with whomever you're working with to set up a natural history, when you're invited to participate in a natural history, I think it's really important for you to understand, you as someone who is contributing this, who's participating in this, have a seat at the table in setting up the terms of that natural history study. You should be asking, what happens to this data when it is contributed? So there's certainly an understandable period where usually that data is embargoed for the investigator, right? They're doing the study, they're doing the research, they have a period of time where they're going to themselves use that data because it's selective for their research only. But after that period of time, a couple years where they're going to take in that data, study it, write papers on it, use it for themselves, that data should revert to your natural history or your registry or whatever process your organization or you have to then utilize it for your own organization. That's the purpose really of having, not one of the purposes of having a registry, where you can then reincorporate that data to your own organization or foundation's forward-moving use. Don't let it just evaporate. You've done work to contribute as a family to coming to these appointments and biobanking and all of these things. Make sure that you have a way for your community's data that you have made possible to continue to be utilized and incentivize further investigation.
Thank you so much. And from the investigator side, you just add the advocacy group to the IRB and the contracts. It's not difficult. You just have to make sure there's always a committee that decides what's happening with the data when we cut, when we analyze, when we share. And it's just try to be proactive in being part of that process. It will help everyone in this disease. It will help everyone with mutations in vascular smooth muscle. It's not only about MSMDS, there will be more than that.